me share something with you now that comes from Charles Blow. First of all, I want to ask, did any of you see the movie The Gangs of New York? Did you see that? I've seen it 3 times now, and every time I see it, I'm just blown away. Essentially, the story is about New York City in the late 1850s, early 1860s, right around the time of the beginning of the Civil War. And the main premise of the movie was the war between Irish who were born in this country, first-generation Irish people born in this country, and the newly arrived Irish immigrants who were just coming from Ireland because of the potato famine and so on and so forth. And the native-born Irish, so-called, had established patterns of control and power. And when the newly arrived Irish showed up, the native-borns wanted to make sure that they understood who had the power among the Irish community. And the Irish community in New York City at the time, on the Northeast, was enormous. Millions of immigrants were coming in. The movie is one of the more bloody movies I think I've ever seen. Oh, my God. But a subtext to that film was the Civil War, although it was never fully mentioned. And the reason it was a subtext, as these newly arrived Irish immigrants showed up in New York Harbor, they were immediately conscripted into the armies of the North and sent almost before they could unpack. They were given a rifle, such as weaponry was, and sent to the southern part of the United States to fight against the terrorists who insisted on enslaving people. And so many of them, unfamiliar with the territory, unfamiliar with the weaponry, unfamiliar with the new culture shock doctrine, were shot dead, hundreds, thousands of them. So as a result, the newly arriving immigrants, Irish immigrants, took out their frustration not just against the native-born Irish, but against the black people in New York, for whom they were told they had to go die in the South to guarantee that the black people in the South would be freed. And as a result, there were riots in New York City that were some of the bloodiest in U.S. history, race riots. Now, having said that, let me quote a bit from Charles Blow in the New York Times the other day. New York City was the site of one of the deadliest riots in United States history 160 years ago this year. It was the draft riots of 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. New York then was hardly the monolithic liberal bastion it has since become. Its economy benefited significantly from the slave economy and the cotton it produced. And although the state's abolition of slavery became effective in 1827, during the following decades, as the historian Sylvain Diouf has noted, the city came to dominate the illegal slave trade to the American South, Brazil, and Cuba. Indeed, the mayor of New York at the time, Fernando Wood, was a pro-Southern, pro-slavery Democrat who proposed that the city secede from the Union in 1861 after South Carolina became the first state to do so the year before. Conservative anti-war Democrats, known as Copperheads, were enraged by the onset of the Civil War, and they were vocal opponents of Abraham Lincoln's war policies. They saw abolitionists as agitators, and their call to end slavery as an affront to states' rights. Many Copperheads thought the secession was constitutional and the war misguided because, as the historian Jennifer Weber explains in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, quote, "The Constitution," they rightly pointed out, "says nothing about the terms of membership in the Union," end quote. So the Copperheads had their presses, newspapers, tracts, began relentlessly racist campaigns that inflamed the passions of poor and working class whites. The Copperheads offered a kind of great replacement theory of its time in 1863, claiming that once freed, black throngs would invade New York City and create competition for white jobs and threaten their way of life. When Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, it served to cement the replacement paranoia. The editor of a Copperhead newspaper on Long Island wrote at the time that, quote, "In the name of freedom for Negroes, the proclamation imperils the liberty of white men," end quote. Then, when the Enrollment Act of 1863 passed, which established the first national draft, tensions boiled over into a bloody 5-day riot. More than 100 people died, although some believe there may have been an undercount of hundreds more. The riots were ostensibly anti-government because the government was forcing people to participate in a war to which they were vehemently opposed. They were anti-black because racist phobias had been drummed into them. And they were anti-elite because another point of tension was that wealthy people could buy exemption from conscription for paying a $300 fee, an amount far out of reach of most working-class men. Working-class white people had been radicalized by white supremacy, racial tribalism, the fear of new arrivals, and anti-government fervor. Now, that is the historical setup to, and that's the end of the quote from Charles Blow, who, if you don't read Charles Blow's columns in the New York Times, you're really missing something. But that's the setup for the rest of what he wrote. And again, it dovetails perfectly with that film, The Gangs of New York. I do hope that you have a chance to see that movie. If you don't, if you're not completely, totally turned off by extreme violence on the screen, it does get pretty awful. I mean, it really does. Anyway, that's the setup. And by the way, let me just give me a second here. The Gangs of New York, it has in it, the people in it are incredible actors. Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays a young Irish immigrant, and Daniel Day-Lewis, who is the anti-immigrant Irish gang leader. And of course, it was directed by Martin Scorsese. It got an Academy Award for Best Actor in a Leading Role, Academy Award for Best Picture. What else? Several other Golden Globes, all kinds of it. So please, it's worth watching. Now, a lot has changed, hasn't it, in 160 years, hasn't it, since 1863? But these devices that are used against us, the devices of dividing us and provoking us, and this means of separating white people from non-white working class people by building up a combination of this bullshit grievance against outsiders is still going on, and against the government. All of this is seen to be favoring the interests of the other over the interests of so-called ordinary citizens. And by that, what Charles Blow means when he says ordinary citizens are white people. And again, it should be understood that for most of American history, the most sought-after part of liberal politics and activism has been to find a way to get past these divisions, to stop already with the racism, to stop already with the anti-immigrant fervor, which is so pronounced in the film, The Gangs of New York. And what liberals, progressives have been trying to find, listen to Bernie Sanders, a way to make the poor and the working class of all races see that all of our fates and interests are linked. A poor white in Appalachia has the same economic issues to deal with as a poor black family in South Georgia or Mississippi. It's the same thing. But because one group is white and the other group is black, all of a sudden that constitutes a huge wall. So race, as it did in the 1860s, as it does now, is this driving wedge in the working class. Religion now has become part of it too because of these so-called Christians. Now, as Charles points out, this is not to say that a coalition can't be built or has never been built. For example, in the New Deal, the Roosevelt realignment of the 1930s, Democrats built a coalition that supported the working class, and that was evident in the legislation that was passed, at least to some extent, regardless of whether the American benefiting was white or black. Now, none of that was perfect. Of course, it didn't attack racism. It attacked economic disparities. So it wasn't perfect because it still accommodated these racist Democrats in the South. But it was, of a sort, a coalition where working class and poor white people and black people were united. But all that began to fall apart in the 1960s with the successes, believe it or not, of the civil rights movement. And ever since that time, black leaders in this country have been trying to reshape that coalition. From Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign, remember that in the late 1960s, the March on Washington, the Poor People's March, Jesse Jackson's National Rainbow Coalition, founded in the 80s. In North Carolina, the Reverend William Barber's focus on fusion coalitions that came out of what he put together in North Carolina. Remember the Moral Mondays campaign that was started 10 years ago to protest North Carolina's hard right-wing neo-fascist legislature. So liberal politicians have tried to develop another method of coalition building, and it's one that sometimes works. That's a cultural, so-called bilingualism that tries to speak to the white working class and educated liberals separately, on their own terms and in their own languages. Charles writes this, but as the forces of intellectualism and what we've come to call diversity exert increasing power in the Democratic Party, non-college educated white voters have fled. As Nate Cohn pointed out in 2021 in the New York Times, after Joe Biden's victory, quote, when the Harvard-educated John F. Kennedy narrowly won the presidency in 1960, he won white voters without a degree, but lost white college graduates by a 2-to-1 margin. And now the numbers were almost exactly reversed for Joe Biden, who lost white voters without a degree by a 2-to-1 margin while winning white college graduates, end quote. And similarly, and this is according to Politico, in 2020, Donald Trump won an astonishing 96% of those districts in which 70% or more of people were white and fewer than 30% were college educated. What does this tell you? It's picked up a new term. This bifurcation of white voters is now being called the diploma divide. There's a new one. But it's more than that. As Charles points out, it also frequently represents a basic knowledge gap. A knowledge gap. Amen to that. But Charles completes his essay this way. Yes, 1863 is in the distant past, but themes from that era are percolating at the edges, and sometimes not only the edges, of conservative discourse. For example, the growing expression and occasional endorsement of the so-called Great Replacement theory. The calls, still marginal, yet increasing, for secession or another civil war. The fear of the other, whether that other is in the form of a liberated slave from decades ago or a southern border crosser from yesterday. The routine debasement and growing mistrust of government, and in particular, government's efforts to improve racial equality. There aren't anti-black riots brewing in New York City, but a familiar vintage anger and unease is growing, and it's deeply worrisome. End quote. That was the end of Charles Blow's piece in the New York Times in the January 18th or 19th edition. And I really do recommend, if you can get online, if you have a subscription or maybe just as a guest, that you get that and read it, because it is elucidating. What? Where did that word come from? It is eye-opening. I really appreciate the fact when progressive writers can use language that's easy for me to understand and historical references that I'm familiar with to point out to me the similarities between the awful then and the horrific now. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.